great to see all of you. Welcome again to the Rector's Forum and to this series on holiness. Holiness described as a way of hospitality, not hostility, with Dr. Peter Gathje, who is a professor of ethics and also teaches theology at Memphis Theological Seminary. A little bit of a lengthier introduction this morning, and then we'll turn things over to Peter. The field of ethics largely has to do with not simply what we think, but what we do. And the field of theology always has something to do with what we think about God and this world that God has created. And it is such a delight to be with someone who recognizes that both of those fields should never be separated. Mm-hmm. And that what we think about God should always be connected to the way we live, and vice versa. I wanted to say a word because we have Peter for 4 different talks. He gets 4 different introductions. So I'm not going to say the same thing about him each time, or certainly say the same thing that Allison said. So I'm going to say a word about his teaching style. And for this, Peter, we are all, and I've heard so many people comment, incredibly grateful. So not only God bless your work each day with the homeless here in Memphis, but God bless your work in the classroom. And for us, it's powerfully obvious how those 2 fields are connected in your mind and heart. You know, there's this incredible tension and a creative tension between the universal and the particular. And when something is universal, what's great about it is it's a way of getting your head above the water or above the trees and seeing a larger field of vision. And then the particular is when you're down in the weeds, the particularity. And there's a creative tension between those two. Too much of one is too much. And so we need a balance. And that, for me, is what has been so interesting about the way Peter thinks and teaches, and he's easy to imagine in the classroom, isn't he? Because the very moment in which his universal thoughts on God or meaning and love and sacrifice, the very moment when as a teacher he begins to get a little bit abstract, you know what he does? He tells us a story. And it's so concrete and particular. And the moment, for me, as I'm sitting there, in which his story or his illustration or his example gets more and more specific, the moment it becomes a little too clear, he steps back again and reminds us of the universal, that larger picture of who God is. And it's like opening a window into a stuffy room and the breeze blows yet again. So for all of that, Peter, it's just really great to be in your presence. And God bless your work in the classroom. And I know that your students are inspired. And thank you for what you've given to the church in the broadest sense.
Thank you.
Welcome again to GraceStLukes and the Rector's Forum.
I don't think I've ever had as thoughtful of an introduction as that. Thank you. The universal and the particular is such a great theme within Christianity because we believe that God became a human being. So you can't get much more universal than God, and you can't get much more particular than this Jesus who walked the earth 2,000 plus years ago, who was a very particular human being. And I think part of the difficulty for us as disciples of Jesus is living within that tension of the universal and the particular. And I think that's why we have 4 Gospels. And then there are those Gospels that didn't quite make the grade either. So thank you. And it's a particularly good introduction today because today is going to be perhaps the most theological of the 4 talks, because we're delving into something that's central to Christianity and yet has been a subject of great dispute about, and that's going to be particularly when we talk about sacrifice. I want to do a quick review of where we've been in terms of hospitality and holiness and the bringing together of the practices of hospitality and holiness. We're interested in holiness because God calls us to be interested in holiness. We're called to be holy as God is holy. And so that raises a quick question. I'm going to go real fast because this is our review. How is God holy, and what does God's holiness have to do with hospitality? So that quote from Romans, "Welcome one another just as Christ has welcomed you," gives us a sense of both the nature of God's holiness and how intertwined it is with hospitality. God is the one who welcomes us. That is the very nature of the holiness of God. And God as other then invites us into this practice of hospitality, welcoming those who are other. So how do we experience God? We don't experience God, particularly God says, in what is familiar or what is controllable by us, but rather we experience God in ways that are disruptive of our lives, that call us out of ourselves, that call us beyond simply the way in which we live day after day, though God can be in the details as well. Even though people say the devil's in the details, God can also be in the details. So what God identifies with those on the margins, with the slaves rather than with Pharaoh. Jesus identifies with the sinners rather than the saved. And that's sometimes kind of confusing because we're supposed to be saved. Jesus identifies with a people who are living under occupation by the Roman Empire. He doesn't identify with the Roman Empire or with those who are cooperating with the Roman Empire, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the scribes. That's why they get such a bad reputation. So biblical hospitality is to those who are on the margins, the vulnerable, the threatened, the oppressed. And this is what then begins our first sort of dimension of holiness. This separates us from the way the world is. It separates us in such a way that we have a different world in view, in which those who are hurting, who are harmed, who are vulnerable, who are pushed to the side, are the very ones that we are welcoming and saying, you are important in our lives. You have as much dignity as any other human being. We begin to see the world differently. Imagine seeing the world from the top of a skyscraper or from the top of the Tower of Babel compared to seeing the world from the streets. It's a very different perspective. Seeing the world from a very nice condominium high up in the sky compared to seeing the world from a box where you're spending the night. It's two very different perspectives, and we're called as followers of Jesus to see from the perspective of the streets. That doesn't mean that the perspective from above is necessarily not helpful, but what it means is that God's perspective and where God is calling us to is the perspective of the streets. So as a kind of summary then, we've talked about what it is to be separated from the world as it is, from the center, to stand in solidarity with those who are on the margins, to serve them in simplicity. And so today we're focusing on how that way of holiness and hospitality requires self-giving and strength. So now everybody in the room, even if you skipped the previous 2 Sundays, you're up to speed. Anybody skip the previous 2 Sundays? No, don't answer that question. So if we're asking about sacrifice and self-giving and also strength, as we've done every Sunday, we've started with asking what is the nature of God in relationship to these characteristics of holiness. So when we get to what is God's sacrifice or self-giving, for us as disciples of Jesus, what's central to the story of Christianity is that we learn of God's sacrifice through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. So Jesus himself learned something of this from the prophetic critique of temple sacrifice and also from the wisdom literature. And so Jesus himself quotes in Matthew 9:13, "Go and learn what this means. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So there is this critique in the Old Testament of the temple system in which people brought animals and money to the temple to offer sacrifice, and the prophets started to see that that was not exactly a way into the life of God. So they started saying things like, speaking in the voice of God, I don't need your bowls, or I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Or in the wisdom literature, for example, in the Psalms, Psalm 51, verse 16, for you have no delight in sacrifice. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit. A broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. So Jesus picks that up in his life. He offers a similar kind of critique, both in word and in deed. And then we get to the cross. And it's nice to speak in an Episcopal setting because we all have a creed that we recite just about every Sunday. And I don't know if you've noticed in that creed, but there's something missing. So we're going to kind of just start to review in the creed. You get to the birth of Jesus, right? And then where do you go next? To the death. So what's missing? The life and the teachings of Jesus. And I would suggest if we had more time, we could unpack this a little bit, but that was not wasn't sort of just something that happened. It was intentional to leave out the life and teaching because the creed emerges in the context of Christianity adapting itself to the Roman Empire. And the life and teaching of Jesus is kind of threatening to empire. And so if you leave it out and you just focus on the birth and the death and resurrection, then you're not as challenged by the life and the teaching. And so what also happens in Christianity is that we get this thing developing that we call today, at least, atonement theology. And here's where we're going to get real academic for just a few minutes, or I could say real theological. There's been a lot of ink spilled onto pages trying to explain how it is that Jesus' death on the cross saves us. In fact, if you want to have an interesting dinner conversation, or maybe it wouldn't be that interesting, but it might be if you're a theology geek, ask people why Jesus had to die on the cross in order for us to be saved. Most of us as Christians, we've just been saying it over and over again for so long that we don't really know. I mean, we know the words, but we don't really, really, why did Jesus have to die on the cross in order for us to be saved? Couldn't God have saved us some other way? I mean, why did there have to be this brutal torturing and then execution of a human being in order for us to be put into right relationship with God? And of course, the early church was really struggled over this, so much so that they did not even represent Christ on the cross until about the 5th or 6th century. So if you're wearing a cross today, a little jewelry, early Christians would have been just deeply offended and scandalized by that because crucifixion was so nasty. And they just had a hard time reconciling that the Messiah, the Son of God, would have ended up on a cross. So, not surprisingly, there was a lot of discussion about this, and theologians argued back and forth. And the one that tends to dominate, the view that tends to dominate today, and I'm grossly oversimplifying, so those of you who are serious theologians, forgive me, but I'm going to collapse everything into two. And it's a little bit more complicated than that, but essentially I think it comes down to kind of two big ways of understanding how Jesus' death on the cross is salvific. And don't worry, all this universal, I am coming back to the particular. So this judicial atonement theology, there's a view of sin that we're probably familiar with, that when we sin, we break God's law. And if we break God's law, we deserve to be punished. There's this little movie that's going on right now. A lot of people are talking about that Noah movie. And that's a pretty good example of it. You know, there's a lot of sin in the world, so what does God do? God destroys most of the world except for Russell Crowe and his friends. So the cross is that Jesus takes the punishment that's due to us for our sin. So he kind of steps in and says, I'll take care of that. So that's Jesus' sacrifice. It satisfies God's demand for the just punishment of us sinners. And of course it works because Jesus, as 100% divine, can take all the sin of the world upon him, and as 100% human, that covers all of us in his humanity. So salvation then, the resurrection indicates that the penalty has been paid. Hallelujah, as we don't say in Lent. It is by God's will that we have been sanctified through the offering of the body of Jesus Christ once for all. And this gets talked about in Paul's letters as well, as he's trying to figure out why did Jesus die on the cross. If you go to the Gospels, there's not much atonement theology. It's just kind of a description. John has a little bit, but there's not much. Whoops, I'm pointing down. There we go. See, it's just a habit. Jeff warned me before, don't point at the screen. There's nothing up there. It's got to point down here. So participation theology, under this kind of heading of Christus Victor, is a very different view. And you note from the scripture references up there, both of these views can find scriptural warrant, scriptural basis. So sin here, rather than being us as individuals breaking God's law and therefore deserving punishment, sin is a power that enslaves us. It takes us over. It's sort of like possession. Think of our teaching of original sin. We're all born into sin. We didn't choose to be sinners. We just are. So the cross is not God's demand that Jesus be put to death to satisfy the justice of God. The cross is rather the powers of sin and death putting Jesus to death, because he's challenging their power. And then the resurrection shows that Jesus has defeated the powers of sin and death. That God, in raising Jesus from the dead, affirms the way of life of Jesus as the way to overcome those powers in a way that does not imitate those powers. Now, by this time, I hope you may be asking the question that is one of my favorite questions to ask in a theology class: so what? So this is where we're going to try to get a little more particular. Is holiness and the Christian life, are we to imitate the 100% self-giving, without any reservation, sacrifice of Jesus Christ? That's our understanding of Christian love. So no matter what anybody does to you, or no matter what happens, you just keep on loving. So say you're even in an abusive relationship and you're being abused, you just keep on loving the abuser. And I hope people are saying, no, that can't be right. But there's some truth in this self-giving, but we've got to be careful. You can start to see maybe, well, we need to be a little bit careful about this understanding of the cross. That first one, the judicial atonement, because it could set up a view of God as almost being a divine child abuser. The only way I'll be satisfied, God always speaks with a deep voice, the only way I will be satisfied is with the blood of my own son. Or is holiness self-giving for the sake of mutuality, the creation of and the sustaining of the beloved community, the kingdom of God? So here there's still self-giving, but it's not self-giving sort of for its own sake. It's self-giving for the sake of building and sustaining the kingdom of God. So the cross is not an end in itself, which we all know. The cross is not an end in itself, but the cross must lead to resurrection. So there's a lot of theological argument around these two major views. And if you want to read a big book, like about this thick, Anders Nygren, who was a theologian, a Swedish theologian, wrote a book called Agape. And he did a whole history of the Christian argument around what is the nature of Christian love. Is the nature of Christian love, and he identified it as God's love that is like this flowing stream that just keeps on coming and keeps on giving no matter what? Or is God's love more like a love that has an element of desire, that we actually hope for there to be a kind of building of community out of the sharing of this love? Now, you might be able to already figure out that I go with the love is building, self-sacrifice is building mutuality. Just the way I set up the argument. I gave the bad one first, and then I said, this is much better. And that is true. The first one I find is very problematic, and because it can lead to this kind of rationale that if you're suffering, if you're poor, if you're enslaved, if you're abused, just offer it up. Join your suffering to the sufferings of Christ. There's a pie in the sky when you die. And Jesus has done it all is another kind of way that people sometimes talk about this. And that, of course, then means there's nothing left for us to do. So that's why it doesn't talk about participation. If you're reading Paul's letter to the Romans, he actually has both of these kind of side by side in chapters. Where did I have that? Chapter 5, chapters 5 and 6, Paul kind of gets into this, and he talks about the first one, the kind of judicial blood atonement stuff, and then he goes on to the participation model, and I think he does because he's recognizing that in that early community in Rome, early Christian community in Rome, that they're running into problems with that simple blood atonement stuff. And the problem was people were saying God has done it all, so there's nothing left for us to do. It's sort of like today when people say, I've been saved, and then their lives are not transformed in any way. Now, the good thing is I'm speaking in an Episcopal setting, and none of you have that foolish kind of theology, right? So I want to apply this now to hospitality. Because in hospitality, and so see, I'm getting to the particular. We run right into, we are offering God's love. And so we have guests who come sometimes who, when we say no, they know the Christian story, because almost all of our guests have been baptized and raised in churches. And so they'll say to us, well, that's not very Christian, when we say no. Or, you call yourself a Christian, and you're not going to give me a coat? Man, it's cold outside. Or you call yourself a Christian and you're not going to make room for me in the showers today? What the hell kind of Christian are you anyways? And my response is always, well, not such a good one, actually, if you need to know. But the theology behind that question is the theology of that Christian love has no boundaries, no limits. If we're really practicing the love of God, we give and give and give and give until we're dead. Or some people like to say burned out. It's kind of the same thing. The feeling of being burned out is that you're dead. And so I think that's a bad theology. It's not a theology that's salvific here or in the future. It's a salvation that asks us to do something that Jesus Christ and God didn't even do. If Jesus Christ and God were in favor of that kind of theology, then Jesus' work was done when he died. And he didn't stop with death. In fact, he rose from the dead. We're going to celebrate that in just a few weeks. And we celebrate that because we recognize that the death is not the goal of Jesus' life. The goal of Jesus' life is resurrection. Now, we can't get to resurrection without self-giving. The self-giving is crucial, but it's a self-giving that recognizes our humanity and affirms our humanity in that we are limited. And so when we practice hospitality, it will take us places where we did not plan to go. It'll take you into doing laundry. I hope you can see that picture good enough. That's Kathleen, my partner at Manna House, and she has picked up a pair of jeans that did not smell so good. So there is, I'll use a more polite word, there's a lot of crap work in the offering of hospitality. There's the cleaning of toilets, there's the doing of laundry, there's the preparing of the space for hospitality, there's getting up early in order to put the coffee on so that when people get there, there will be coffee when the guests arrive. There is accompanying guests that you've known for years as they die. And they didn't die happy, they died as you've known them, which is people who have been on the streets. And so you do memorial service, things I never really thought about getting into hospitality, that I would actually be accompanying people through death. You also end up doing things that you would have never imagined that are kind of funny but sort of against the law. I'll give you one story. Kathleen was picking up one of our guests at the Med, and she had just had her legs amputated because of complications from diabetes. And so she's discharged from the Med, and Kathleen's going to go pick her up. She's not really sure where she's going to take her, but she's going to pick her up from the Med because Sarah has called. So she goes, and Sarah's out on the sidewalk in one of those wheelchairs, you know, just a standard wheelchair from the hospital. It says on the back, it's spray painted, the Med. And Kathleen gets there and says, all right, Sarah, well, what are we going to do here? And Sarah goes, well, you're going to put me in your car, and you're going to take that wheelchair, and you're going to put it in the trunk. Because I need a wheelchair to get around. And the hospital doesn't just give them out. So you're going to take one. And Kathleen kind of looked around and not seeing any police, took the wheelchair and put it into the trunk. And off she went. And just to say a little bit about Kathleen, she's a very typical middle-class woman who, up to this point, had never been engaged with any sort of nefarious activity. So you get asked to do that, and it's kind of like, what am I going to do? I'm being asked to do something that takes me beyond what I did not anticipate. It will also disrupt our lives, this self-giving. Don't worry, I'm coming back to boundaries. This is a little picture of me laying on the street in Memphis a few years back before we went up to pay a little visit to our political representative, Senator Bob Corker. So we were having a little demonstration about the war that was going on at that point in Iraq, and we were going to go up and then have a discussion with him, which we did, and then we all got arrested because he didn't want to have the discussion. But why were we laying on the streets? Because we were trying to give some kind of witness, strange as it might have been, to the misplaced priorities that we think are in this country, about the billions of dollars that go to defense spending and the rather paltry amount of money that's spent to help people get off the streets in terms of housing, for example. So we're thinking about the misplaced priorities. And how do we become aware of those misplaced priorities? Through our relationships with people that we're serving in hospitality who tell us stories about things like when you're discharged from the hospital and you have no legs and they don't give you a wheelchair. I guess you're just supposed to crawl around on the streets. So there's a way in which we end up doing things that we hadn't anticipated. I'll give you one other story. I was at the Open Door community in Atlanta, which is a place of hospitality for folks on the streets there. And we were offering lunch, and we were serving it out in the front yard of the Open Door. And as we were serving lunch, several police officers came up into the yard, didn't identify themselves or ask permission to be there or anything like that. They just walked up and put handcuffs on one of the guests and started walking him off the property into a police car. And that particular morning, I was in charge of hospitality in the yard at the open door. So I walked up to the officer as they're taking him away. I said, "Why is this man being arrested?" Because we need to know why he's being arrested, because that gives us a sense of where he may end up in terms of being jailed, so that we can kind of follow his case through. And the officer turned to me and said, excuse my language, "It's none of your goddamn business." I said, "Excuse me, officer? I think it is my business. You were just on our property. You made no announcement. You had no warrant, search warrant or anything. You just came up and arrested one of our guests. I'm asking you again, politely, where are you taking this man? Why has he been arrested?" And he said, "Shut up or you're going with him." And I said, "All I'm asking is a simple click. The handcuffs are on me," and off I went. And it was quite dramatic, which is always good, I think. I like drama. Because there were about 30 students from the Candler School of Theology there who were studying, about issues of poverty and racism and things like that, and police, stuff in the city, and it's all nice and safe and academic until somebody goes to jail. And I'd just been talking with those students, and so all of a sudden I'm being let off in handcuffs, and I'm yelling to the folks in the yard, "Tell the leadership team I'm off to jail." And sure enough, I was off to jail. And the funny thing was, I was supposed to leave that day to go back to Memphis because I was supposed to preach at a church on Sunday. And so here I was in jail, and usually when I get arrested, I'm ready. Like, I've got phone numbers, we've got a support team, all the stuff that people who do civil disobedience do. But I had not anticipated being arrested. My life was being disrupted. I was supposed to leave later that afternoon, in fact. And here I am, I'm brought into the city jail in Atlanta. I'm in shorts, it's kind of chilly in there, and I have my t-shirt on that says, "Jesus was a victim of the death penalty." And I'm also the only white guy in there. And so they bring me in, and everybody's kind of looking at me, and I'm kind of looking at them, and there's not a lot of conversation. And I'm trying to remember phone numbers. I know I get a couple of phone calls, and and I can't remember any phone numbers under pressure. It's the bad thing about cell phones. So I finally remembered one. I was able to make a call. But then they announced bond for people who had been arrested, and mine was $10,000. And when they announced my bond, all the guys who'd been sort of looking at me strange were like, "Dude, what'd you do? What'd you do?" I said, "I just asked a question." They go, "That must have been a hell of a question." And then we had a lot of fun then until I got out about 12 hours later because they paid the bond. The Open Door community did. And that was a very powerful experience for me to actually be arrested like a normal person instead of the civil disobedience person. Now I want to talk about the limits because back to the cross, our lives will be disrupted. We will be led into places that we had not anticipated, but we also have limits. And so at Manna House, for example, we're only open 3 mornings a week, and we close at 11:30. At 11:15, we make last call for the bathroom and for the coffee. And so I come out and I say, last call for the bathroom. If you need to pee for free, like Jesus did in Galilee, I'm quoting Ed Loring there, then come and use our bathroom now or forever hold your peas. Because if somebody shows up at 11:25 after we've done last call and people, no, you can't use the bathroom. And people rightly get angry sometimes. Or in the morning when I get there at 6:45 and somebody needs to use the bathroom, I don't let them in. Because I've got things that I've got to be able to do in the house without having a stream of people coming in to stream. So we have to have limits. And if we don't have limits, then we don't have a place of hospitality in which to welcome people into. Think of the image of a door. A door both can keep people out or it can be opened and welcome people in. But we need doors in order to offer hospitality. There has to be a place into which people can come in for hospitality. There would be no place for hospitality if we didn't sometimes shut the door and have some place to welcome people into. So I'm going to move quickly now to strength, so we have a little bit of time for some discussions or questions. We've been through 5 characteristics of holiness and hospitality, and by now you might be thinking, I'm certainly thinking, it's kind of hard work. And so we need something to sustain us in this work. We need the strength of God. We can't do this on our own. So the strength of God, my strength is the Lord my God, who makes me leap like the deer, or at least wakes me up in the morning and keeps me going. That raises the question for us again, what is God's strength? Because if we watch the Noah movie, we might think that God's strength is the ability to destroy the world, which may be one way to think of God's strength. But God's strength, as it's brought to us through Jesus and through Christian theology, is that God's strength is relational. Our God is a triune God, a God that is social, is communal. God's very being, the strength of God in God's very being, is relational. So that's why I have a picture of the Holy Trinity up there. And they're supporting each other in a life on the streets, which is what happens with our guests. Sometimes when we say no, a person comes in at 11 o'clock and asks for a pair of socks. Sorry, the socks and hygiene list, we're done for the day. Can't give you a pair of socks. One of the guests will go, hey man, I got an extra pair. So that kind of relational power. It's shared power. It's also liberating power. When we see God's power in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, it's a power that is directed towards liberating us from the powers of sin and death. We think of Jesus, how he exercises his power. The same kind of thing. Jesus' power, he has those temptations to have a different kind of power when he begins out in the desert and Satan is tempting him in those 3 ways, with economic and political and religious power. It's all power over. The power as the ability to control people, to make people do what you want them to do. That's very tempting. I like that kind of power, actually. It's one reason I'm a teacher. But it's not God's way of power. God's way of power is inviting us into a shared power. In fact, Jesus can't even heal when people don't believe. Remember that story? He couldn't do anything there because people weren't believing. They didn't have the heart for healing. So Paul takes up that vision of Jesus' power in Philippians, that great hymn of the self-emptying of the second person of the Trinity, who humbles himself to become a slave and to die on the cross. That's God's power. God is so powerful that God can empty God's self of that kind of power over and be the true power of God, which is the power with us. Or as Paul talks about it in Ephesians, he's subverting in Ephesians. This is that famous passage about the full armor of God, put on the full armor of God. And Paul talks about prayer and the Spirit and truth and justice as being the full armor of God. And he's subverting the imagery of a Roman soldier and the power of the Roman Empire. So our power as disciples of Jesus is not the power of the Roman Empire or any other empire, it's the power of God. So we conquer not by the sword, but by the cross, by the blood of the Lamb. And that's what makes us stupid in the eyes of the world, that we're fools for Christ, that we actually think we can change the world through a revolution based in love. And remember, this is not the love that just says, let people beat the crap out of me no matter what. This is the power of nonviolent resistance to evil. As Paul says in Romans 12:21, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome the power of evil with good. So we don't imitate the power of this world, we subvert it by living in a much more creative and challenging way. So instead of criminalizing people on the streets, we welcome them as our brothers and sisters. So we've got a different way of power. Earthly power is power over. You've got a problem with people on the streets, arrest them. You're afraid that they're going to hurt your business, arrest them. Put up signs that authorize people to be suspicious. If they see somebody in an area that person doesn't look middle class, call security. That's the power of the world. The power of God, which we're supposed to and we're called to and empowered to practice in the practice of hospitality, is to actually get to know and welcome those people who look threatening. And that's risky because sometimes people can be threatening. And that's why we also have to have some sense of our limits. We were driving down Union Avenue the other day, Kathleen and I, and we saw a guy walking down Union Avenue in a hospital gown. We said, "Hey, that's Tommy. Wonder where he's coming from. Lakeside maybe? Somewhere? I don't know. Maybe downtown?" He had his clothing in clear plastic bags. So we stopped and we said, "Hey, how you doing?" "I'm doing great." That was his first response. We said, "Tell us your name again," because we didn't remember it right away. And he goes, "Not Obama." So that was a pretty funny answer. He's a white guy. So we talked, we said, "Do you need anything?" "No." "Can we help you in any way?" "No." "Where are you going?" "I'm going to a gas station." "Can we give you a ride?" "No." Well, we're like, we're kind of at the end of our options here. So what did we do? We called the police. And the reason we called CIT, the Crisis Intervention Team, because a guy walking down the streets carrying clothing in a hospital gown is not in his right mind. And he wasn't. He was dangerous to himself, at least. In fact, we saw him crossing Union right into the traffic of Union just a few minutes later. So we hope he got picked up and that he got the help that he needed. But it's a recognition that, sometimes we use the powers of the world even to try to accomplish the powers of some kind of Christian hospitality. So it can get complicated. We'll leave that for the questions. But for us, applied to hospitality, is the only chain that we can stand is the chain of hand in hand. So that's our strength is the same as God's strength. It's relational. And we start then each day on our front porch at Manna House, holding each other's hands and praying together that we can all practice hospitality with each other. So we invite our guests to offer hospitality as well, because nobody can do hospitality unless everybody is really on board with offering hospitality. And that brings us back to the limits again. We have to have expectations for our guests in terms of language and behavior, that without those expectations we can't offer hospitality. So now next week what we're going to do is we're going to focus more on that power that's in prayer, that relational power that comes to us in worship, in our ongoing relationship with God. And so that's why we're ending with this seventh dimension of holiness and hospitality called spirituality. We'll have to unpack that nice controversial word. So we have just a few minutes for a couple of questions. Yeah.
A friendly disagreement, and then
Thank you.
friendly disagreement is, okay, on the creed.
Uh-huh.
I would say two things, and this is not my question. This is for a cup of coffee or a beer one day. So
Good. I'll go with the beer, please.
But originally, I would say creeds were all also read in the context of the liturgy, which included the lectionary.
Correct.
So you've got to look at it that way, even if it's manipulated at certain points in history. Certainly it was. Today still in most mainstream traditions is a part of the liturgy of the Word.
Right.
So it must be read in that context, less as an either or. It'd been nice to have a clear footnote or even life and teachings. I agree.
That's the only change I would make. Otherwise, it gets too wordy.
My question is this, and I'm going to say it personally. Imagine there may be somebody else who feels the same way. I don't want to get arrested. And
me either.
I really can't. Because I've got a wife, I've got kids, I've got all these people.
They'll come visit you. You're a lawyer.
When I listen to you, I'm incredibly inspired, and I'm very tempted through each of your presentations, frankly, to idealize you.
Don't.
Let me finish. I start to think things like this. My God, how does he do all this? My God, he does, like I preach it, but he actually teaches it and then lives it. And I start to do some of this to you. What would you say to me or someone else? This is my question. Give me a small step.
Excellent question.
Give me a modest, or are you comfortable? Can you respect my modest step in that direction in ways in which I can begin to imagine less dramatic, but perhaps nonetheless powerful ways of using pulpit, pastoral life, education at this private school, how can you respect and include me in your work in that way? Do you see what I'm asking?
Absolutely, yes. Excellent question, thank you. We are followers of Dorothy Day at Manna House. We're part of the Catholic Worker Movement, and one of her lines, which is drawn from the scripture, is little by little. So the big dramatic gesture is usually not that helpful. It's the dailiness that keeps hospitality going. So in terms of the specifics of your question, more than a meal. You're here, you're doing it. Keep doing it well. Keep offering hospitality. Keep making sure it's hospitality. Because that's a real challenge. It's very tempting to fall into a kind of we're going to control these people in a way that makes us more comfortable. So, and there's a fine line between that and hospitality. So, more than a meal. Come to Manna House and volunteer one morning, even part of a morning. We have people who I can't give 3 hours on a Monday, Tuesday, or Thursday morning. Okay, fine, come for an hour. Come for 10 minutes. Stop in and have a cup of coffee. Go with June. You know, get involved with OHC. She's got all sorts of little jobs that you can do. If you can't do it yourself, one of the things that you can do for us that is very important, and everybody can do this, is pray for us and pray for our guests. And you can make phone calls when a public policy issue comes up that affects people who are on the streets or people who are just poor in general. Call your legislator. Don't just send them an email, you know, like with moveon.org. That's cheap and easy. Actually, pick up a phone and call them. That counts a lot. Or write them a letter, an actual letter. Because they are representatives, and they tend to listen if just out of self-interest that they want to get reelected. So we can do those kinds of very practical, very safe, for the most part, forms of Christian hospitality. And it's yeah. Don't think that like Manna House just emerged one day full and complete the way it is. The first day we opened, all we were doing was serving coffee. That's it. We didn't have showers. We barely had a bathroom. We started small and we've stayed small, and that's crucial also for hospitality. Don't come up with big plans about how you're going to end homelessness. That's what the mayor's office does, the 10-year plan to end homelessness. It sounds like the old Soviet Union. It's not going to work. 10-year plans don't work. It's nice maybe to have that vision, but what are you going to do day in and day out? So start small, stay small. More than a meal seems maybe by now sort of routine and almost insignificant and not enough, but I can tell you it's important. It's very important for people on the streets to have a place where they can come, know that they're going to be welcomed, fed a good meal, and treated with dignity. That's crucial hospitality. It's not big-time stuff. It's not going to earn accolades. You know, every once in a while it might. Mostly it's going to make your neighbors suspicious and, but it is crucial stuff. Donations, somebody asked me before, you can always make little donations or big donations to Man a House or other places that are helping folks on the streets. Donations for OHC, always accepted. Write June a check. She'll be happy to take it. Yeah, she'll never turn you down. And those are crucial steps that everybody, I think, can do. If you want to donate stuff to Man a House, just see me afterwards. I can give you the more detailed information. But we take stuff. And part of the mundane stuff of offering hospitality is actually sorting clothes. You want to come and take an hour sorting donations and learn what we need and don't need, you're more than welcome to come, and Kathleen will put you to work. So those are just a few, but thank you. June.
Just one thing we could do, Richard, that's really simple is at more than a meal, they write out their prayers.
Yes.
We could include them outside this room and into the other room over there without it probably being a big deal. And the other thing is, a very wise man once told me, Stephen Bush, that when they die in a bed after being on the street, that counts. I have used that phrase over and over and over again. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have a legal team?
No.
Do you have volunteers? If someone's a lawyer, can they volunteer their time and their services?
Sure. We'd be happy to have even lawyers.
What happens when you get arrested and somebody pays the bond?
Never pay bond.
What do you do?
Public defender's office can't take it if you pay the bond. You pay $3,000 out of your own pocket. Never pay bond.
The open door, I'll tell you what often happens when we get arrested is that we go to court the next day or a day or two after and the charges are dropped. The system generally doesn't want to deal with us. So they just drop the charges and tell us to go away.
Peter,
Yep, we need to stop, I know.
It's been wonderful, and since he's been complimented, Stephen Bush will be around, and Peter Gathje. Thanks.
Thank you.